Welcome back to another video of the Beginner's Guide. In the last video, we had a first look at the basics of CSS. And we learned that we can use selectors to apply styles to elements. Now there is one really important core concept that we have to understand now. And this core concept is the so-called CSS box model. Now what that is and why we need it, let's find out in this video. So before we have a look at this box model, some quick theory first. Because we learned in the HTML part of the series that we have two types of elements. We have block level elements and we have inline elements. Now the important thing is that CSS refers to all elements, this means all elements really, so no matter if it's block level or inline, to all elements as boxes. Basically, this means if you use a selector to, style an element, this element is interpreted or displayed as a box from a CSS perspective. Now, this sounds really abstract probably. Therefore, it's now the time to have a look at our web page right here and see if or where we can find this box model actually. So let's go there, and how can we have a closer look? Well, let's reopen the Chrome Developer Tools. Now we are back again in the Elements ribbon right here, and let's maybe focus on the header. So I'm clicking right here. Now we have applied some basic style to this header with that purple background and that white font color. But the more interesting thing now is that if you go down right here to the header and then to styles, then you can see this, box right here. And in case you cannot see it, you can just scroll right here and you can also increase or decrease the size. So just adjust it the way that you can see this entire box. Now, and I mentioned that already, as this is the box, this is the way CSS sees or interprets this element right here. So in our case, this header element. Now, what do we have right here actually? Well, if you hover over the center part right here, you can see that this blue color is again applied on our website to the headers part. And this blue part right here is the actual so-called content of that box. Now, around that content, we have a padding, the screen part, and you can see on the website to the left that we don't have such a padding at the moment. Then we have the border, also not available right here, or not displayed right here, and we have a margin. Now, I think the best way to understand this box model is to just add these three things to our header element. This means we add a padding, border, and a margin. Now, for that purpose, let's go to our code. Let's go to the header right here. And let's now add first the padding, and we will then also see what that is. Let's say we add 10 pixels as a value. Important, you can add different values here, so not only pixels, but I will dive into the details regarding the options you have right here later throughout the series. For this video, we will stick to pixels. Then we have the second property. This was the border right here. And for the border, we can also define a size, which could be 5 pixels. Then we can decide if we want to have a solid border, like that for example, or a dashed border. I will use a dash border here. And then we need a border color. Let me maybe use something like red in this case, like that, because we will remove the border after we understood the box model. And then the last thing we had was the so-called margin right here. And for the margin, we could use 10 pixels, like that. Now let's save that, as always, really important, and go back to our website. Now if I reload that, then you see that the look totally changed. Why did the look change? Well, again, I selected the header right here. And if you now have a look at our box down here again, then you can see that the content is now the blue part again. We saw that before. But you can see that this blue part now is not the entire, element now actually. Because our element, which is again displayed as a box from a CSS perspective, consists of that content now. Then we have the padding. You can see that green part now in our element up here. We have the border. This is this orange part or that red dotted line that we created. And also important, we have a margin. And as you can see, the margin is basically around our element, or it's not displayed, it's invisible, but it's still there. And as the name says, with the margin, we can of course define the distance between different elements. We'll have a closer look at that, of course, also throughout the series. The important thing is that now you saw the general structure of this box model with the different components it has basically, and which allows us to style our elements. Now, another option how to get a better understanding of the structure of the web page and also of the box model is if we go right here, there, and now select this tool right here. With this tool, you can see now it's blue, so it's selected. With this tool, we can inspect our website. What does this mean? Well, if you go right here, you can see that now we have, sorry for that, down here, the explanation that we are now in the header element. That's important. But we can see this header element from the box model perspective, basically. Because in the center, we can now again see the blue part, this is the content. Then we again have the padding, then we have the border, and then we have the margin. So with this inspect tool, you can get a really quick overview of the structure of your website, and this is really important if you want to apply your CSS styles. Now, why is this important? Well, if you think about the structure of this header element again, you know that we have a nested element inside that. We have the h1 element. And of course, you can also see that h1 element right here. And if you think about the logic of the box model, then this simply means that the blue part right here in the center, the content, well, what should the content be of that header element? As this header element kind of consists or wraps this h1 element, then the content of that header element should be the h1 element. So if we hover right here, then you can see exactly that. Let me maybe hover back. Can you see it? It switches because now we are in the h1 element. And our h1 element right here consists of the content, the blue part again, and it consists of that orange part. This is a margin, as you can see in the right lower part of the screen, which means that we have an automatically added margin to that element right here. But this again shows you the logic of that box model. h1 is now basically the content of the header element. But of course, we can also add a padding, a border, and a different margin to our h1 element. Let's maybe try that by going back to our code and now simply copying the declarations right here from the header and paste it right here in the h1 selector right there. Let's now save this. Let's go back. And if we reload the page now, well, then you can see this, well, not really beautiful style, but you can see that if I now go back again into the h1 element, you can see that we now have the content, still the same as before, but now we have a padding around that content. We also have a border, and we have the margin now applied. Now what happens if I go back to the header element now? Did you see it? Now the content of the header element consists of the entire h1 element again. And by entire h1 element, I mean that this consists of the content of the h1 element, the padding, the border, and the margin. Now that again shows you the general logic of that box model that CSS uses. Now we will dive deeper into the box model automatically throughout the series when we talk about the styling and also the positioning of the different elements. But I think for now, it's really important for you to know that you have this box model, that this is the way CSS displays or thinks about the different elements we have in HTML. And additionally, that you can use the Chrome developer tools, this element tab, and then right here, the styles part, to get a really quick overview of the current style applied to your website. Now, as I said, we will dive deeper into the box model throughout the series, but there is one other thing I would like to show you in this context. Because if I go back to the code, and well, now if you look at the padding, let's use the h1 selector right here. If you look at the padding, for example, or the margin, you can see that I just wrote 10 pixels right here. Now, I talked about the pixels and that we have different options right there. We will talk about that later. But what happens if I write something different, like 20 pixels right here as a second value, actually? Well, let's save this and have a look. If we reload that, well, then you can see that the content, so our h1 element, is displayed differently. Let's maybe select the h1 element right here, and let's go down right there now to the styles part. Because can you see what happened? Right here, the padding, the distance now changed. Because top and bottom is still 10 pixels, so that was the first value we wrote. But the left and the right padding is now 20, so the second value that we wrote. You can also see it now if you look at the website again with the bigger gap we have to the left and to the right when comparing it to top and bottom. So this means that if you only write the two values, you define top and bottom with the first values and left and right with the second value. Now let's go back to our code and think about another way how we could write that, because now we have top and bottom. But what if I write 30 pixels now as a third value and 40 pixels now as a fourth value? Well, let's maybe save that and let's go back. And if I reload that now, well, then you can again see down here that now the padding changed like that, because the first value defined the pixels above the content basically, so the top. The second value defined the right, the 20 pixels. The third value defined the bottom. And the fourth value defined the left part of the padding. So this is also something that is interesting to know. If you just write one value, then you define the distance in that case for all four parts. If you just write two values, you just define the top and bottom in one value and the left and right in one value. And if you define the four values, well, then you define each part, so top, right, bottom, left, in that order, like we see it right here. Now, going back to our code, we can of course also apply that right here to our margin, for example, if you want to, like that, save that, and if you go back and reload the page, we can see that the padding has now 10, 20, 30, 40, and the margin has 10, 20, 30, 40. So this is what we can do with that. With that approach, we can define the size basically of the different components of our box model. Now, with that knowledge, we can actually continue now and have a look at the structure of our page and see if we can already apply some styles to the different parts that we have right here. So for that, let's go back to our code right here. And let's now think about a structure that would make sense. Because what I see right here is that the background color, for example, could actually be added right here in the H1 selector, like that. Then we could get rid of that header right there. And with that, we would only have the H1 selector right here. Now, why am I doing this? Well, we basically know that the header element basically consists of the H1 element in total. This means, as we just saw, it makes sense to only define the H1 element. And if we then don't apply any kind of padding, border, or margin to the header element, so the wrapping element, then this simply means that the header element only consists of the content from a box model perspective and therefore is equal to the style that we define right here for the H1 element. Now, as I said, we want to have this background color. I will delete the font size because I will dive deeper into the font size and text topics later throughout the series, so let's get rid of that for now. The color can be white, this is fine. The padding, well, let's say we want to have a padding of 10 pixels all around the actual content. We don't need a border, so we can delete that. And actually, we also don't need a margin, so let's get rid of that also, like that. If we now save that and go back and reload the page, well, then we can see that Mike's world looks like this now. Now, what can we see right here? Because we can see that there is kind of a bigger gap on top. So let's inspect that quickly. Yeah, and we can see that we still have a margin here above and below the H1 element. We have kind of an overflow right here outside of the header element. Now, I will not dive into the details why this is happening right now at this stage of the series. The important thing now is that we can simply get rid of that actually by going back to our code and simply define that the margin like that should be 0. Like this, no pixels, nothing, just 0. And by that, if we go back to the page and reload that, we can see that this margin is now removed. This was automatically added by the browser basically, therefore it makes sense to define that this should be 0 right now. However, let's maybe unselect the inspect tool now and think about other parts of that website. I will not talk about the positioning of the different elements right here because I would like to change home and contact. It should be displayed next to each other, but this is also covered later throughout the series. I would only like to think about the background now. Well, in thinking about the background, the first thing I see right here is that we have this white background right there. And actually, I would like to have a slight grayish background on our website. And if you think about the logic we just saw, then we can actually just go back to our code and maybe add it right here on top and specify that HTML, so HTML, so the entire document, like that, should be gray, the HTML part. And with that, if I just write background, like that, so like that, color, that was the important thing we need. So that's the property. Well, and the color should be, let's say, gray maybe, like that. Or maybe not that gray. So if you're not happy with the color, you can simply go right here and hover over the color and then simply pick a color that you would like to have. So maybe let's use this one right here, like that. And if we now save that and go back, then we can see that our page now has this slight grayish look. So in the background, and with that, we have changed our style a little bit. But let's now go back to our code again and think about the other parts. Because if I have a look at the index.html file right here, then I'm okay with the header. This is fine. The navigation part, if we look at it, yeah, not final yet, but we'll focus onto that in the next videos. But what I don't like right here is this main part, because if we look at it, well, yeah, the image is too big, or the images are too big. That's one thing. We'll also work on that in the next videos. But I don't like the structure from a code perspective, because if we go back right here, well, then we can see that we have the main part. So I'm talking about this part here. And we have this list right here. This is okay generally, but actually I don't want to have a list in that case. I would like to change the structure. And what would I like to change? Well, let me maybe add it up here and explain to you. I would like to have one div, and then I would like to have a second div right here. And like that maybe. And in the first div, I would only like to have the paragraph, so the text, so this text, and the California landscape, like that, and add it right here. Again, select the two and indent it like this. Yeah, this is fine. So this is the first div. And in the second div, I would only like to have the image right here. So landscape image, right here. And not the landscape image, this was the city image. And now we have the California, the California streets image right here, like that. This means I would like to get rid of that list down here, like that. And now, change the way it is indented. And well, now we have a problem. Because if I change the structure like that, then I have these two divs. And what I could do now, let's say I would like to have a background color for the paragraphs right there. Well, then I could say that the entire div right here should have a background. So what we could do is we could go right here and write div as a selector, do it like that, and add a background color like that. Let's maybe use a hex code, and let's use FA923F like that. If we do that, and now save also the index.html file and go back right here and reload it, well, then we can see the following. The styling, so the background color is applied, but of course not only to our div right here, but also to the div that's kind of around the images, but also the div that we have with the footer elements. So this is not good. This means we actually need a way how we can specifically target this div now. Now, one option could be that we refer to a paragraph. This means we go to the styles and now define that the paragraph, like that, should have an orange background color. If we do that, save it and reload it, we can see that this basically works. It's now orange. But the same thing is also true for do people like my page, because we also have a paragraph at this position. So if you go back, right here, we see that we have these paragraphs and we have the paragraph down here. So also not a good option, because we could then define something for the paragraph and then change the paragraph style down here again. Not a good idea. So let's think about something different, because what if we would be able to kind of specifically target this div right here? Now, as I'm pronouncing it like that, specifically targeting elements can be possible if you add additional information to it. And we learned how we can add additional information to elements already, right? We can do this by using attributes. And you know that you can add attributes to each element. And one specific attribute that we can use right here, and also an attribute that is only used in the context of CSS, by the way, is a class. Now, what does this mean? How does it work? Well, let's add a class first, right here. So in the div, and let's write class. Right here, you can see the attribute. And let's maybe call this class trip text or something like that. Just feel free to call it as you want. Now, if we save that, so that part in the index.html file, now go back to style CSS and now change that from a paragraph to that class as a selector, then it should work. The question is now, how can we use classes as a selector? Well, the answer is we can simply type a dot and then type the class name. So in our case, this was trip text. Was it trips text or trip text? I don't remember. It was trip text. So let's name it trip text like that. So this must be equal to the class name. So if we save that and go back to our page and reload it, well, then you can see that we now specified the background color. Important, if you look at inspect right here, the background color is now specified for this entire div. So not specifically for the different paragraphs that we have inside that div. But if we scroll down now, we can see that in the other parts, no background color is applied. Now let's have a closer look at that actually, because what if we now would like to change the background color of that paragraphs inside our class? Can we do that? And again, I will not use the paragraph element as a selector, because then this would again change the do people like my page paragraph also, which I don't like. So let's go back to our code. Let's think about that. So what I would like to do is I would like to be able to specify a background color for our div class right here, which we did. And then I would like to say, yeah, but inside this class, I would like to have a different background color for these two paragraphs. How can we do this? Well, if we go back to our styles sheet right here, and now maybe add a little bit of padding first, because otherwise you won't see what happens. So let's maybe add a padding of just 3 pixels, something like that. But now we want to refer to the elements inside a specific class. How is this possible? Well, we simply type again the class, so trip text, now space, and now we say p. Because this means that we will now apply the style that we now define only to the p elements that are inside this trip text class. Now, what does this mean? Let's do it like that. Let's again define a background color, because I think it's the best property to kind of show you how this works. And let's now say this should maybe be white, like that, and a semicolon, and save that. If we now go back to our page up here and reload that, well, you can see what happened now. Now, if we inspect that, we can see that we have that paragraph right here. And again, we have a margin. So let me quickly get rid of that margin like that. So I added a 0, so no margin for the paragraphs. Let's now reload that. And now you can see what I wanted to show you. Because now we have that paragraph right here with the white background color, the same thing for here, right here. And right here, this part is now the div. So if we go back to our code and maybe increase that padding to, I don't know, 10 pixels, and go back and reload the page, then you can see it better even. We now were able to specify a styling for specific elements inside a class and define a general styling for the class these elements are in. Now, we will also dive deeper into that throughout the series, but this example should just show you how, well, powerful such classes actually are, because you can really be precise about the styling you want to apply and about the elements you want to apply this styling to. Now, back to our code, because now we have defined the trip text and the elements inside the trip text. But if we go back to index.html now, we see that we have another div right here for the images. So let's maybe also apply a class right here. And this could be trip images, for example. Again, you're totally free to name these classes based on your preference. Now, if we save that and go back to our code and reload it, we can of course see that nothing changed, but now we know right here that our two images now are part of the trip images class. We will use that later when we talk about styling of these images, but for now, it's actually fine to just define that class like this. So the main part is fine now, so this area right here, important. Just keep in mind that classes concept, because as you can see, it is really powerful and we will use it throughout the series a lot actually. And if I now look down to the footer, so right here into this element, well, then I'm okay with the content. There is one thing that I would like to change though, because if we go right here, we can see that we have the image of Max and Max text, and here my image and the text of myself. And I wrote that as a span in the HTML part, because I wanted to show you the span, of course, this inline element we have right here. But actually, I would like to change that to a paragraph now, like this, and like that, and like that. Save that, because as you can see right here, we now have the text displayed below the image, which is not the way it should be, so it should be to the right of the image. But the thing is that we just saw that we use CSS to style our page, therefore the styling shouldn't be done like that with the span, but we should really use CSS then to work on the positioning of the text. We will do that throughout this video, of course. So let's go back to our code, and actually I'm happy with the status we have right now, so we have to continue working on our side, but it's okay. But I would like to take the chance at the end of this video to change two things in our code. Now, the first thing is related to the introduction of classes we just had. Because if we go back to our style CSS file, so right here, then we see this h1 selector right here. And I said that we will select the h1 element right there because we only have this single h1 element in the document, and therefore it's fine to apply a style to this h1 element. Now the problem is that in modern HTML5 times where we are right now, you can have multiple h1 elements on your website. Therefore, applying a general style to this h1 element is totally fine in our case, so for this example project. But on your website, which could be more complicated and even bigger, well, you might have multiple h1 elements, and therefore defining that general h1 style is maybe not always the best idea. But as we just introduced the classes, we have an easy way to change that. Now, how could we change that? Well, we could simply go back to the index.html file. Now go to our h1 element up here, and now apply a class, maybe a class of, let's say, page minus title, something like that, and save this. Also note the way I wrote this class now, so this page minus title. That's the second thing I would like to change right now in our code, but more about that in a few seconds. For now that we have changed the class right here, or applied a class, we also have to change the selector. So let's go back to style CSS, and now change this from h1 to page minus title, like that. If we save that, go back to our page and reload it, then we can see that nothing changed, but now we made sure that we really identify or select specifically this h1 element right here in the header. As I said, doesn't make a difference in our case, but generally it's a better way to write it like this. So we added that class, and why did I add that class name like this, so page minus title? And why should we also change it down here in that trip text class and in that trip images class right here? Well, the reason is that in HTML and CSS, we have a special convention when it comes to writing text, the so-called kebab case. And this kebab case simply says that we should connect words, so like we have it right here in our class, with a dash, this one right here, simply to improve the readability of the code. And the second convention in HTML is that we should write every text with small letters. The reason for that is simply that for HTML and CSS, writing page title like that or page title like that is basically the same. So HTML and CSS cannot differentiate between capital or small letters. Therefore, we use the convention of writing small letters only and connecting the different words with a dash to improve readability. Now we change that class right here and right there. So we also have to change it in our styles file right here. So let's add a dash right here, trip minus text, and trip minus text p, like that. So if we save that, and also save the index.html file, of course, and go back to our browser, nothing should have changed. Let's see. Yes, this still looks fine right now. And with that, we are actually done with that video. So now that we understood the box model and the classes, we can actually move on to another really important core concept of CSS. Well, actually, these are two important concepts because in the next video, we will talk about the positioning property and about the display property. Really important, as I said, really interesting also. So I hope to see you also in this video. And as always, I can only say thanks a lot for watching. Hope to see you in the next video, and bye.